I thought it was like official. He made it. That's a good man right there. If I would be to have it. I know. No.
It is 6:30 p.m. and I call this meeting to order. Please stand and we will recite the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Winona City Council. Tonight, we will be moving a few agenda items around. We will be taking 5.5, the ordinance disorderly uses on premises, off the agenda. In a moment here, I'll be calling up Lucy McMartin, our Community Development Director, to speak on that. Also, we will be moving items 5.1, the financial management policy, and 5.2, set the sale for city equipment certificates. That will be moved till up to after item 2.1, the public hearing. Our presenters this evening are traveling, so we're going to try and be considerate of their time this evening. Lucy, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mayor and members of council. I also want to thank Police Chief Tom Williams and the City Attorney and Chad Summer, building official, who developed the disorderly housing ordinance. Although we did meet with the members in the community within the neighborhoods and with the landlords, we intend to go back and meet again with the landlords and again with the people in the neighborhood who were having some issues. That's why this ordinance was developed. So we'll come back after we have further input and conversations with those two groups. Secondly, I did want to note that there was a news article and there's incorrect information. It stated the new ordinance would allow city staff to fine and ultimately suspend a rental license of a landlord. The only entity that can suspend a rental license is the city council. And so I just want to clarify that staff does not decide whether to suspend a license. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. This past week, I was lucky enough to be able to greet the new Symphony from American Cruise Lines, and it was pretty cool. We had two steamboats there at the same time, or two cruise ships, which really is impressive, and it speaks a lot to our ability as a port and the facilities that we have down at the levee to be able to fit two boats down there at the same time. Obviously, we've had a lot of cruise traffic this year, and it's been a huge economic benefit to the city, I believe. I would like to thank the Winona Chamber of Commerce and also Visit Winona for being down there this past week, and then obviously their work throughout the year to help welcome those visitors. In general, the feedback that I've gotten from the visitors is that Winona is one of the, I'll use my own term here, one of the cooler cities that they've been able to visit, but also they've spoken highly about the citizens of Winona and how welcoming they are. And I think that speaks to what we have here in Winona. Also, real quickly, I haven't done this for any other council members, so I apologize because your birthday has not fallen on a council meeting, but Councilmember Rapinski is turning 29 for what, the 10th, 11th, 12th time, 20th time this year. Yep. So happy birthday, Councilmember Rapinski. I will now turn it over to City Manager Chad Ubel.
Mayor and Council, this evening we have a couple of retirement announcements that we'd like to go over with the council. So I'll start with Rich Cope. Investigator Rich Cope retired on September 30th, 2022, after 26 years of service. Rich began employment with the city on April 29th, 1996 as a police officer and was promoted to police investigator on November 23rd, 2013. Prior to joining the Winona Police Department, Rich served in the United States Army and Minnesota National Guard. During his career, Rich served as a field training officer, active shooter instructor, and pepperball technologies instructor. He was a member of the emergency response team and a canine handler for his dog, Jake, for 10 years. In 2013, Rich was promoted to investigator. During his time in investigations, he was assigned a rotation as a school liaison and worked on cases involving narcotics and general investigations. He was also a member of the Southeast Minnesota Violent Crimes Enforcement Team. Rich received many letters of commendation for his work throughout his career. Rich was instrumental in providing evidence to effectively prosecute offenders for person-to-person crimes and illegal drug distribution. Just a few years ago, Rich led an investigation in the city of Winona that led to the seizure of approximately 165 grams of methamphetamine, over 200 doses of LSD, 10 grams of cocaine, and approximately 80 grams of marijuana. He has also been quietly recognized by several task forces for his role in regional and federal narcotics investigations, some having ties to foreign drug cartels. Due to staffing shortages, Rich was reassigned from narcotics to sexual assault investigations at the end of 2021. Even in his last year, Rich attended several sexual assault related trainings and conferences in an effort to better serve victims. He was a member of the Sexual Assault Interagency Council and worked with child forensic interview teams. Rich's experience, relationships, and attention to detail served the Winona Police Department very well. Rich will be best remembered for his quiet and intelligent approach to policing, which made him a very good police officer. He'll be remembered as the ultimate prankster. On his last day, Rich gave a few words of advice to the younger officers, and I quote, "You'll remember the worst of times and the best of times. You won't be able to always control the worst times, so be sure to create your own good times and laughs. I always loved a good prank." On behalf of the entire city council, city staff, and the Winona community, please join me in congratulating police investigator Rich Cope on his retirement from service. Wish you a long, healthy, and happy retirement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
You gotta look our way.
Oh.
We'd like to also congratulate Police Sergeant Kevin Kearney, who retired on September 20th, 2022, after 24 years of service. Kevin began his career as a police officer on August 16th, 1999, and was promoted to police sergeant on October 12th, 2013. Kevin served in many different capacities over his career with the Winona Police Department. From 2001 to 2004, Kevin taught drug abuse resistance education classes to all area fifth graders. The DARE curriculum taught students good decision-making skills that help them lead safe and healthy lives and cope with high-risk circumstances, including drugs, alcohol, violence, bullying, and internet safety. In addition to in-classroom education, he coordinated DARE activities for students, including graduations, field trips to the Minnesota Twins, Timberwolves, Lynx games, summer camping, pool party events, parades, and fundraisers. He also spoke to social clubs and organizations about the purpose and impact of DARE education and the important role of adult mentoring. From 2005 to 2013, Kevin served as the community liaison officer, where he strengthened the connection between the police department and the citizens of Winona through a variety of personal safety education and training programs, and the coordination of neighborhood watch groups and national night out events. Kevin was also instrumental in alcohol retailer compliance training for area liquor establishments. During his tenure with the department, Kevin was actively engaged in a number of committees related to his professional work, including Treatment Court, Minnesota Crime Prevention Association, Winona County Restorative Justice, and the Police Department Honor Guard. Kevin volunteered in the community with the Boy Scouts as a board member for the Project Fine and Community Education. Perhaps most near and dear to Kevin professionally was his commitment to Steamboat Days. Over the years, Kevin was the go-to supervisor during the festival and the liaison between the Steamboat Days committee and city staff. His work helped to keep things running safely and smoothly year after year. In 2011, he was named Harbor Master for Winona Steamboat Days celebration. As patrol sergeant, his skill, knowledge, and wisdom related to public engagement were greatly valued. His dedication, compassion, leadership, and positive attitude will be truly missed. Again, on behalf of the city council, city staff, and the Winona community, please join me in congratulating Sergeant Kevin Kearney on his retirement from service. As always, we wish you a long, healthy, and happy retirement.
Thank you.
Same thing.
Mayor and council have no other comments tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Chan. I will now ask the city clerk to take the roll call.
Mayor Sherman,
Here.
Councilman Young,
Here.
Moeller,
Here.
Alexander,
Here.
Iden. Here. Worzakowski,
Here.
Rapinski.
Here.
Under the required public hearings, item 2.1 is a public hearing for the city equipment certificates.
For each public hearing, staff will make a short presentation and then we'll ask if anyone from the public wishes to speak to the matter. Each person needs to clearly state your name and address, and you'll be given up to 3 minutes to make your testimony. I will call 3 times for public comments. Once the hearing is closed, the public may not participate in the discussion by city council.
And council, the public hearing tonight is to accept public comment on the city's general obligation equipment certificate, of which a portion of the proceeds will be used to finance the equipment at the Masonic Temple.
Thank you, Jessica. I will now open the public hearing. Does anybody from the public wish to speak on the matter? Again, does anyone from the public wish to speak regarding the public hearing for city equipment 501c3 bonds? Asking again, does anyone from the public wish to speak on item 2.1, public hearing for city equipment 501c3 bonds? Hearing no one, I will now close the public hearing.
I would make a motion to approve the sale of the certificates.
No motion on this one.
Oh, I thought we had to.
Now we will move to new business. Item 5.1 is the financial management policy.
And tonight we have Terry Heaton and Christine Hogan from Baker Tilly.
So Mayor and council, just before Terry and Christine begin the presentation, I did want to mention that the item tonight, we are recommending that the council, after a staff review, that we recommend and adopt the financial policy. However, we do also recognize that this is a lengthy document, that staff has certainly spent a lot of time on this policy. So if there are questions or things that you would like further discussion or some revisions made, that we still can do that. We would need to bring that back at the next council meeting on October 17th. Reason that we need to do that by the 17th is that we have our ratings call for the equipment certificate. To adopt this policy is critical in that ratings call. there is flexibility if, because again, it's a large document and it certainly goes without saying it's an important document. So we'll spend a significant amount of time here now with Baker Tilly with the presentation. And again, if there's questions during the presentation, certainly ask. Otherwise, obviously at the end, we'll allow time for questions as well. And then Jessica and I can also interject or answer any questions that may be more of an internal nature.
Could I ask, are you saying that any change at all would postpone this to the next meeting?
If there's a change that the council agrees to tonight,
Okay.
you can vote and make that amendment.
Right.
We'll make that change without bringing it back. But if there's large changes or there's significant changes, or there's something that tonight that you'd like further discussion on, we can bring it back. So with that, we'll have Christine and Terry. I think it's probably easier at the podium. So you've got a place for your papers, and then we'll bring up the presentation here in a second.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Just for introductions, we're here. I'm Christine Hogan, Terry Heaton, my colleague. We're here from Baker Tilly. We're here to just give an overview of the financial management policies. As you can see, it's a large document. Our goal is to kind of highlight on a top level, higher level, important pieces. We will open it up to questions between the policies. And of course, we'll have opportunity for questions at the end of the policy, our presentation. So slide.
Next slide, please.
One more.
And one more.
There we go. Thank you.
So like I said, we've been working with your staff, Chad Ubel, City Manager, Lucy McMartin, Community Development Director, and Jessica Wojan, Finance Director, over the last couple of months, developing financial management policies for the city. The purpose of this policy is to provide an outline of management policies that the city council and staff can use in making decisions. There's 8 policies in all in here. We have the budgetary financial control policy, we have investment policy, capital improvement policy, external auditor policy, fund balance policy, and debt policy, and then post-issuance policy and risk management policy. And each of those will, I'll present some, my colleague Terry will present some, so kind of a little tag teaming here. So the purpose of this, like I said, is the number of reasons to enhance the city council's policy and policy making abilities, to provide sound principles to guide decisions of the city council and city staff, to employ revenue policies and forecasting tools, to provide and improve essential public facilities and prevent deterioration of the city's infrastructure, to protect and enhance the city's credit rating and prevent any defaults on municipal debt issuance, and ensure the legal use and protection of city's fund through a good system of finances, financial and accounting controls.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, I'm going to kick it off with the operating budget and the financial and budgetary controls related to that. So there are several in the beginning of this policy. There are more, but I'd say 3 major areas of control that are with the budget. And the primary responsibility for managing the budget, it lies with the department directors. And so that management has to do with their reviewing the documents, making sure they're improving things properly, reviewing financial reports, and making sure that they're staying within the expenditure budget. And so I think that's important. Some communities use the finance director to crack the whip and be the control. And I think it's important that it's understood that the finance director, it takes a village, everyone, it takes a city in this case, so that every person signing off on the budget has their role to share. The second part of the control is the finance director does have a major role. They monitor the overall budget in total, and they work on the operating progress routinely throughout the year with these department directors. But again, it's a shared responsibility, everybody in charge of their own budget. And then at the very top, at the level where the city council sits, that you set the budget. And the department heads, city manager, finance director, they all operate within the overall approval for that budget that's set annually. And then after that, the city manager really is responsible for the city operations. And so if there is something that's not in the budget, a new or initiative or unbudgeted expenditure, if it exceeds $20,000, then the city council must approve that. And otherwise, the city manager would then have the authority to work in amounts less than that. And that's pretty common. That is the Minnesota statute guideline for that. Then it talks about, in the operating budget, there is a time, Chris will talk about debt later on, but as far as short-term operating and borrowing, and this has never been an issue for the city, but you want to have enough funds so that you never have to borrow internally for operations. You borrow for major capital or major improvements. And that would be a red flag to the credit rating agencies anytime a community has to borrow just for operations. The other thing is when you balance your budget, they ask, revenues over expenditures or equal to expenditures when you're setting the budget. And yes, you can balance it, but to make sure you're setting it without using the reserves and that you're not doing one-time things like selling an asset, because it's really hard to repeat that the following year. So you want an ongoing long-term balanced budget. The policy also requires ample time for and give the public an opportunity to comment and provide feedback during the budget setting policy. A lot of that came about even more so for communities with the truth and taxation requirements, but I think as an ongoing time, this is in your policy that your staff wanted to make sure this was part of the project or the policy. Then just looking at different components of it and looking at revenues in particular, how you're going to pay for all the services. You're going to endeavor to have a diversified and stable revenue system. It's hard to do because a big part of what you're paying for comes from property taxes. But some of this has to do is looking at, the fees and looking at all the revenue sources and trying to diversify where you can. The next part talks about conservative estimates, so that you are not being too aggressive on the revenue portion and usually trying to be really conservative on the expenditure as well. So that if anything, you've got a little excess at year end, so you can allow for contingency. And that you set the revenues with an objective analytical process, and you have a methodology, you're looking at history, you're reaching out for resources to do that. The city will review the fee schedule annually for all the governmental funds and set fees that will provide the full cost, including anybody that charges their time to a service, so that you can adequately set the fees. On the enterprise funds, most of your governmental funds are supported by property taxes, and so you have a little bit of wiggle room. On the enterprise funds, those that are supported primarily by fees, that you'll include the direct costs, the direct charges, the indirect costs, depreciation, and so forth, and you'll adjust the fees so that you can recover the full cost of those operations and maintain positive cash flow and an adequate working value or working capital fund balance. The policy also says that certain funds, and we know that in Minnesota in particular, there are swimming pools and different operations in different communities that are really hard to be able to support. Ski resorts, different things that, very seasonal, and they won't support themselves, but they're an important amenity for your community. It brings employers and employees. And so if there is a tax levy component to support that it's set up front. It's not because you've had a deficit and you just transferred it at the end. It's determined at the beginning of each budget cycle, any of these enterprises that are partially supported or fully by taxes. And the other part that there, one of the revenue sources you might have is when you close out a fund. So oftentimes if you pay off debt early or on time, there might be a little bit of reserves and you can transfer that into another fund. Or you've done a capital project and there's a little bit left over. And so that the, any transfers like that would be approved by the city council. So you're aware of it and can use it as you decide. On the expenditure side, again, controlling how all those revenues you bring in, how they are spent and controlled. The driving force here, and we had a fair amount of discussion, I think Chad is bringing up this piece and talking about it, and that's the public purpose doctrine that is in state law and as an important part of the expenditure part. And it's basically saying the Minnesota Supreme Court, is talked about any expenditures have to have a public purpose, and that it's rather than a private purpose. It'll primarily benefit the community as a body. It's directly related to a function of government, and the primary objective is for the benefit of the government and not a private interest in type. And so sometimes when you do have private, you do provide services, but an example might be building permits, where the primary benefactor is the developer who's coming in. And so in those cases, you would charge for it. Sometimes it's a combined benefit. If you had a swimming pool, it would be, or some facility like that, they would pay fees for the daily use, but it's more than you can support. But that's where the public support for that makes sense, because it's also a public benefit. And so to consider those things as you're setting the revenues for and as you're spending that money. On the expenditure side, the city manager is responsible for overseeing all city expenditures as the chief purchasing agent for the city, and responsibility for administering this expenditure policy is then delegated to the finance director. And again, every department head is responsible for those expenditures. The other thing that the city has, and there are different policies across the board, but I think in a fully transparent manner, the staff is recommending that all expenses have to be fully documented. And we talked about even under $5, we let it go, and they were saying, no, they want all of them documented with expenditures, the date, time of the event, business reason for the event. So they've got full documentation for every expenditure. And the other piece to control expenditures is the assets that you have. If there's personal use or private use for any of those, or just use at all, like, a city vehicle or any property, that requires the approval of a supervisor. So there's a lot of controls that are more. These are just some of the highlights and important controls to protect the assets. Yes.
So moving on to investment policy. This policy describes how the city's cash and investments will be managed. Three main focuses are really on safety, liquidity, and yield. A prudent person is going to use good judgment when making decisions on investments. Management responsibility for the investment program is designated by the city manager to the finance director. Staff involvement, investment process shall refrain from conducting personal business. Those are all safety focused, which in investing public money, you need to make good judgment. Liquidity, you want to be able to properly align your investments. So when they mature and you need cash, you're not having to pay penalties. As you can, Minnesota statutes 118A provides guidelines for what is and isn't allowed in investing. It's a conservative approach, and it's laid out for safekeeping of the city's investments. The finance director is responsible for establishing, maintaining internal control structure to ensure that the assets of the city are protected from loss, theft, or misuse. And the finance director will prepare a semi-annual investment report and distribute that to the city council.
So Mayor and Council, that item is a new item that we haven't put together before. So beginning in January, you'll see a schedule of investments or report of investments that we'll provide for you. And you'll also see that in July.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next policy is the capital improvement program policy. Next slide. Next slide. The objective of this policy is a way to protect the city's physical property that the city owns. One way of doing that is creating a 5-year capital improvement program is very important to not only the city, but the credit rating agencies look to that, and then having that updated annually. Capital purchases that exceed 50,000 and are financed outside of the annual budget. The multi-year plan is the 5-year capital improvement plan. It's the commitment to systemic plan for maintaining the assets, paying to maintain your assets in today's dollars rather than having deferred maintenance and paying more in the future. And
then the last bullet point addresses the fund balance. So if the general fund balance exceeds the 50% that was addressed earlier in the presentation, that excess fund balance will be redistributed between the 4 funds: the equipment fund, facilities, infrastructure, and park revolving fund, based on a formula that the finance department develops. And so essentially that formula is going to put more of those dollars into funds that are below the level that they should be at for funding those projects. So if the equipment fund is low, you'll see more dollars going into the equipment fund than another fund that may be flush.
Eileen?
You said if the something about exceeds 50%, is that the 50% of what?
That's 50% of the general fund expenditures.
Okay. So for like whatever year we're in?
Yeah, so for the budgeted year.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
See,
I think that's kind of the same question I have. Point G here saying, if the city is more than the required annual fund balance, so the definition of more than the required fund balance is greater than 50% of the general fund expenditure. Whoa, okay. It's like a tongue twister. And weren't we saying on another page back here that if we get that we wanted a minimum fund balance in the general fund of 45 to 50% of expenditures? Or am I confusing those two things?
Mayor and Council, that's right. On page 5, item C, that is addressed. It says the city will strive to maintain an undesignated and unreserved general fund balance in the range of 40 to 50% of the general fund revenues and or expenditures of a balanced budget.
Above 50%,
Then
all of
it gets redistributed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Redistributed at the end of the year, years
Right.
over and, okay,
Years over.
Close the book.
We're closing just before we close the book.
thank you, thank you. Got it.
any other questions, George?
Oh, thank you. Excuse my voice. I had a concert this weekend. Now, money at the end of the year, if there's anything left over, you're kind of talking about this? Or is that different from what we have here, what you just talked about? Like the year's over, let's say there's, $500,000 left over. That gets put into those 4 funds.
Right. That's right, George.
As long as it exceeds that 50%.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay.
And Mayor and Council, before Terry continues, I think this is a good point also. If you turn to page 48 in your packet, in tonight's packet, your council agenda packet on page 48. And we don't necessarily have to spend the time right now because but I think it's pertinent to at least point this out and then we can have discussion after the presentation. But under G on page 48, it explains the four funds. The equipment replacement fund now has a definition. The facility fund has a definition. Infrastructure has a new definition, and park revolving fund has a new definition. And I would point out in the infrastructure replacement fund, we are stating that replacement of cities' infrastructure, including but not limited to bridges, streets, flood control system, and park trails. That's a new statement and a new definition of that fund. And again, we can go over that in more detail at the end, but I think it's important to point out now that we've adjusted the definition of those four funds.
Jessica, real quick, a point of clarification. So we'll use George's example. We're 50,000 or 500,000 over the 50%. As we're reallocating that, you had mentioned if one of the funds is below the balance that we would like, that one gets filled first. And then the, like, let's say equipment replacement fund is 100 short. We would fill that with 100, and then the remaining 400 would be distributed amongst the four. Is that, am I looking at that correctly?
Mayor and council, that's close to what I was thinking of. I was thinking of dividing it. We're going to put together a formula for prorating that. So we wouldn't pick and choose which one
Gotcha.
would, like, we wouldn't, if one was $100,000 short and another one was $20,000 short, we wouldn't just fully fund
Okay.
one of them. It would be distributed on a pro rata basis between the four.
Understood. Okay. Steve.
Chad, I will want further development of that point 3 there, how we assembled that list of bridges, streets, flood control, and park trails. What a collection. So either now or sometime.
Okay, when the presentation's done, we'll certainly circle back.
But thanks.
Okay. We'll move to the next slide. Thank you. The external auditor policy. When you create the financial statements that are produced and approved by the auditor, those are shared with rating agencies, investors, and others who look to those for your financial position. And so it's important to make sure that the auditor signing off is independent of the city. And that means they're free, both in fact and appearance, in that from any conflicts of interest, any it's not a member of the city council. It's also part of the audit team. That the audit organization is not responsible for becoming part of the management, and they're not creating any of the financial statements or put them in a position where they're basically signing off on their own work, because that impairs judgment. I mean, we all read about the Enron situation and things like that, where people are afraid to speak up and say something isn't quite right. So that's all this is. There's just saying that they maintain their independence by staying out of the management and making sure they're truly an outside firm looking in. And then sometimes when auditors come in, and this is pretty common, they'll come in and they'll do their normal audit, they'll bid on that, but there'll be a new pronouncement, or they'll need special additional services that are not going to impair their independence, but it might be another review or another add-on service. And so if they do that, then it says any non-audit work exceeding 10,000 has to be approved by city council, and you'll be able to take a snapshot then and make sure that you can gauge that they're still maintaining their independence for that work. A lot of these are integrated. This has a lot to do with how you're going to spend excess money, but it's actually defining what is the fund balance and how does the policy come about. And about, 10 years ago, Jessica probably remembers more than I do, about 10 years ago, GASB came out with a new pronouncement, and they broke out, instead of just having fund balance, they came out with all these categories. And so we've included in the policy what those categories are. But I think the most important thing, rather than going through all of that, is to say on the general fund, what the rating agencies are looking for is that under unrestricted fund balance, there's a total of your committed fund balance. Those are decisions that you might commit the funds, but you can undo it as a city council, so it's still technically free. And it says assigned, but I think the actual terminology, the terminology I use is unreserved, unassigned, but you guys actually assign. We just had this discussion before the meeting. You're actually assigning your cash flow. And so it is unassigned, but if you're assigning it for cash flow, but I think we are just going to make sure the policy combines those two. So that is what the credit ratings agency will look at, those two columns together to come up with your 45 to 50% of the general fund expenditures for the following year. And then this discussion following that on my bullet point is really what we just went through before, defining the fund types and then how that would be allocated with the formula that is being developed in the finance department. The other discussion that we had is beyond that, special revenue funds. It's usually a grant that you get. And so to come up with that, it's usually 100% of whatever's in that fund has to be spent for that purpose. Debt service funds, very prescriptive. Whatever comes into the debt service has to be used to pay for that debt until the bonds are either called or retired. And then capital funds are also usually restricted in total for either capital, construction, state aid categories. And so those take care of themselves. But looking overall at all of the funds that you have, the general fund, enterprise funds, internal service funds, finance department, Jessica is, we've talked about and shared and is looking at developing a fund balance goal for each of those. And I think with that, Chris, you're going to talk about that.
Mayor, Council. Moving on to debt policy. So this policy is describes a debt program to give direction to the city council and staff, and it provides directions for what type of debt you can issue, repayment terms, and revenue pledges. So starting with the city will confine their long-term borrowing to capital improvements, equipment, and projects that have a life more than 4 years. The city will endeavor to keep the total maturity length of their general obligation bonds below 20 years, or at least 50% of the principal paid within 10 years. These policies are not only important to the city, but it's also something that's really important to the rating agencies. That's something that they pay attention to. The city will maintain regular communication with the bond rating agencies, and they will have a follow-up policy of full disclosure. There's more, SEC has enhanced disclosure requirements. That has been something we've seen over the last several years. So that is something that is important to disclose. And we have a policy for interfund borrowing that may be undertaken for capital expenditures or grants or special tax anticipation where there's the following criteria is met. Reasonable payment schedule for repayment of the borrowed amounts and covenants. Interest charge shall be included in to compensate the lender for the use of its financial resources. This kind of moves nicely into the second, the next policy. The next slide, please. Oh, you got it. Which is the post-issuance compliance policy for tax exempt government bonds. And like I said, the SEC has had enhanced their disclosure requirements. So not only is it a legal requirement, it's also very important when the city does issue debt to let the public be aware of what the investors are looking at. They want to what they want to know. They want to understand the city's policies. They want to understand their debt. So it's important to disclose that for investors when they purchase their bonds, or even afterwards. Investors will go out and look on it's called Emma, which is a depository that everyone can visit and find out clients' debt. And a lot of this is mandated by the SEC. And it's, like I said, it's very important for disclosure to maintain your credit rating. Failure to do so could have a negative consequence on your rating. And next slide. So the next policy that we have here is the risk management policy. This essentially describes the way to making sure the city has policies in place to protect the city's assets. The reserve fund should be an estimate of of claims to be covered in the next 3 years, plus any unexpected claims, using an average of the city's history of claims over the last 16 years. Staff will report to the city manager at least annually on results and costs. A comprehensive risk management study, including adequacy of reserves by an independent consultant, will be conducted at least every 7 years. And deductible amount considered to be prudent in light of the relationship between the cost of insurance and the city's ability to sustain the loss shall be maintained. So basically adequate insurance, adequate reserves to protect the city's assets is the intent of the policy.
Pam?
Thank you. Could you please tell me what kind of risk and what kind of loss are we talking about here?
Any kind of lawsuit, catastrophic event.
Okay, so we're talking about natural disasters.
Could be that. It could be a lawsuit if someone fell out on your public property and broke their back or something. So
Okay, so is this,
accidental.
okay, well, in the wake of the Hurricane Ian, I'm just considering tornadoes, floods, all the big events that can happen. Is the city anticipating those with this kind of a policy?
Maybe Terry, you can answer that one a little better than, but that's a great question.
The policies that are covered that we're talking about in here are protecting of the city's buildings that you own. And it protects you on actions that your city staff would take, to be, any kind of action that becomes a lawsuit. And there are certain acts of nature that would affect your buildings, and so fires or if there were a flood or something and it hurt your buildings. I don't know if you have we haven't dug into what types of policies you actually have if you've got flood and hurricane insurance, but that, usually when you get into there is a balance that you look at with FEMA, and that would come to take care of a lot of the damage if it's a large scale like that. And there's usually a larger policy through the League of Minnesota Cities that covers, that to a certain extent. So I guess I can't tell you, I didn't dig through and see exactly what you have for that coverage, but that's what we're talking about, is really protecting the city's assets. As far as all the homes and properties, of course, within the city, they would all be under their own policy.
Of course. Okay, thank you.
Eileen?
Jessica, you had mentioned one of the new pieces was, or maybe Chad had the definition in one of our funds. And there was something else you had mentioned that was a change from the financial policy we're currently under. I'm just wondering if we can kind of go through it. What are the biggest changes between our previous financial policy and this one? Since we're updating it, might just be good to earmark those.
Mayor and council, I think one of the biggest changes in the financial policy is that we're putting into writing practices that have been in place that weren't previously in writing. And then one item was in the investment policy, we're going to report to council twice a year our investments, and then in the CIP section and in the fund balance section, we're defining the 4 internal service funds of equipment, facilities, infrastructure, and park revolving.
Thank you.
I mean,
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so that would be an excellent segue to the question I alluded to before, under capital improvement program policy. Jessica, I think you just alluded to that. So it's about on page 20, if you're looking at the small numbers, page 48, if you're looking at the big numbers. G3, we have this unusual collection of things: bridges, streets, flood control, park trails. Makes me wonder why airport runways aren't in there. Seriously. I assume that I assume port facilities are handled somewhere else. I'm just thinking of infrastructure that we have. They're not buildings. Airport runways aren't buildings. I've been, reading through this, trying to mentally make a list, thinking what belongs there, what are we not thinking about? I will have a question about bridges, because I remember we just did a bridge and that was state funded, but now we're talking about putting it in here. So I need some breakdown on that. Streets, we have street money elsewhere. Flood control systems, I totally get that. And then park trails is not in park revolving fund, which seems weird to me. There's a whole collection of questions there.
So Mayor and Council, I think what you've done is illustrated the struggle we had with the infrastructure fund and its previous definition.
Okay.
When we internally think about infrastructure, we immediately went to water, wastewater, streets. Then the discussion internally involves, and we say, well, we've got a reserve fund for wastewater, we have a reserve fund for water. So what is the makeup of the infrastructure fund? Why are we reserving money if we have those other funds, reserves in those other funds? So then, of course, it goes right away to flood control system.
Okay.
That seems, obviously for Winonans, that seems very logical and rational. But then we get into items like bridges, or streets, and then obviously the one that's really new is park trails. And when we talk about infrastructure, that's certainly a larger debate really across the country. Like, some communities is broadband considered part of infrastructure. We put park trails in here primarily because of the recent awards through legacy dollars. We're going to invest heavily in the park trails and the bluff system. $2 million in state bonding for the riverfront trail that will become our responsibility. And again, the hope is to continue that further east, become a larger responsibility of the city. And then, certainly you could do that in the park revolving fund, but again, full transparency, that fund, as we've discussed before, is primarily for the maintenance of city park grounds and equipment, and although trails are, as we talked during the budget process, when you've got $45 million of deferred maintenance in the park system, and then you add on these assets of trails, we put it in infrastructure instead of park revolving, primarily because of the other needs within the park revolving fund. I think the key caveat, though, is that, as you mentioned, airport and other airport runway, that's why we really struggled to say that the infrastructure includes but not limited to, of course, as the caveat there, but also that any of those funding requests would come back for council for approval. So it's not an automatic. So if the current council doesn't think we should fund, park trails through infrastructure, that the ability to have it come back and be approved by the current council making that decision, that there is that second requirement as well. That's really the basis for the change in definition for the infrastructure. I think if you have a specific bridge question, then I'd prefer Brian to answer any specific bridge question.
Bridges that aren't still here.
I can chat with Brian offline on bridges.
I would just make, Mayor and Council, I would just make one other comment with bridges is also remember that we have bridges within our city limits that may not receive also then state funding that we should be concerned about. High Wagon Bridge would likely be one of them.
Yep.
Now, yes, we have some dollars set aside for the maintenance of that facility or bridge. But again, that's one that likely may not get state funding or assistance from the state. And then we would be quote unquote limited in our ability to fund that project. That's just one example.
Michelle?
I'm going to say maybe the issue with the park trails is that the word park is in it, and what you're really talking about is bike trails. Isn't that what we're funding, like the riverfront trails, bike we're doing bikes up in the hills. Maybe it's just you want to have park trails where you visualize walking in the park, and what they're talking about is the transport. Like I look at infrastructure as transportation is what it looks like to me. It's dealing with a lot of our transportation, bridge, roadways, flood controls. Just a thought, if that's really what it is, maybe you just want it in both places. I don't know. I mean, there are plenty of park trails that need park care inside of our park system that aren't specifically bike. Anyway, but I was going to make a motion to adopt the financial management policy so we could have a robust discussion. Second.
Motion from Michelle, second from Eileen. Any more robust discussion? Steve?
I tell you, the best thing I heard is that this is codifying or writing down, putting into writing what we've been doing. Thank you. I mean, there's a huge deal that we're doing this. I've read through this numerous times, and we have a duty to the public to share with them how we spend the public's money. This isn't government money. There's no such thing. It's the people's money. It's the public's money, and open, compliant, organized. Yeah, we've been doing these things, and I have a high level of trust for our city staff. But putting it in writing is really important. We're doing that. We're taking steps to do that. So I'm happy with what I'm seeing here. Thank you for your work.
Thanks, Steve. Any other comments or discussion? Any questions for Baker Tilly? Yeah, Steve.
Are we voting on this? Are we moving ahead to that?
We were going to move on to 5.2 after this.
Okay. I still question why park trail. I'm just it's got the word park in it. That park trails belongs to park revolving. I'm very much in favor of funding our park system. I'm a park rec guy. I'm a heavy user. Don't print that in the paper of the park system. Okay, and so I want to make sure we fund this stuff, and yet I feel that I would group that. I just maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not a big deal, but I feel like we would put maintenance of park trails in with park revolving fund. If park revolving fund is suffering for lack of funds, well, we need to address that. For organizational sake, I would move to amend Michelle's motion to move. Oh, wow, got to get the glasses on here. The word park trails from point 3, moving that to park revolving fund on page 48.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion from Steve, a second from Michelle. Any comments or discussion on the amendment? Pam?
I understand the desire to have all of the meanings separated. I'm a word person myself, so I understand that part. But what practical difference will this make if we're moving the park trails from this fund or that fund?
Chad?
So Mayor and Council, I think one of the primary differences, and maybe the best example I could give is that, as an example, if we write a legacy grant for more trail work within the park system, and as an example, let's go down the road of the council has agreed that we should put $1 million match in for a request where we can capture maybe $3 million back. The park revolving fund doesn't have $1 million in it.
Mm-hmm.
Infrastructure does. And so we would have the ability to come to council and say, if we really believe in this project and we want to fund it, you now have a definition in the infrastructure fund, replacement fund, where we could use $1 million as an example for a match. I think that's one practical difference. Now, the reverse of that, I guess, as well, at some point, we hope to have the park revolving fund have more than, $100,000 in it with the deferred maintenance amount that we have within the park system. But up until that time, we really don't have then another option or ability to do that. We could certainly stretch and say maybe it's facilities, or we could I think it's too much of a stretch, obviously, to say it's equipment. So really, we're limited either to park or infrastructure fund. I don't disagree that I think that the comment about just leaving it as trails, I'm not sure if that helps. Or maybe if the hang up is park, as far as I'm concerned, park can go. Recreation. Yeah, so.
The way I'm looking at this, and I only read it once, Steve. I didn't go through it multiple times, but the way I was reading it and the way in general that I view, let's say, park trails, they are high cost infrastructure pieces. Now, you could use the riverfront trail as an example in that it would potentially increase mobility throughout town. And in that case, you know, regardless if it's a bicycle, walking, dog walking, it does to a certain degree increase mobility across town. And I look at I turned off that page, but I look at the park revolving fund as more of a playground or a repair at the pool or, you know, I guess I don't know what all would fall under that fund, but maybe a new mower or whatever is needed, you know, and I guess that would be equipment at that point. But in general, the way I had read that was I was interested by park trails as well, because that to me indicates that there is some type of a mobility piece to it. And it's an infrastructure piece in terms of being able to get around town. We could use the very light analogy of bird scooters and how they've potentially increased micromobility around town. Having that type of an infrastructure piece, such as a trail, would potentially allow for more movement around town in that regard, and potentially also affecting different parts of town in terms of the economic benefit of different parts of town. You know, whether a new business, there's a new ice cream cone shop on the riverfront, you know, that kind of stuff maybe. And that's the way I looked at it. So go ahead.
Would it be fair to call it a recreational trail rather than a park trail? Is that a better name?
Mayor and council, perhaps that is the better name.
What?
Perhaps that is the better name. And the other thing I guess I would just mention to continue this discussion just for another minute is that when we look at the city of Winona and think to yourself, what's one of the highly most used assets that we have? I will argue till midnight tonight that it's the Lake Park Path. If we had to do major reconstruction of the Lake Park Path, again, you're limited with the limited funds currently in the park revolving fund. If you needed to do some repair to the east or west Lake Park Path. So
pull it. You know, with the explanation and helping me understand this, I'm going to withdraw the motion. We're good where it's at. So
Okay.
Park trail, recreational trail, I'm at peace.
He's at peace.
Point of order, we can just go back to the original motion, Monica. Okay, very good. So we had a motion from Michelle and a second from Eileen. Any other comments, questions, or discussion? George?
I just think Chad explained it best that if you're going for legacy grants or going for funding, matching funding, yes, it probably is better off right in that infrastructure fund.
Sure.
So,
I think another point as well is that it doesn't mean we can't change this down the road. If we see it not working out after a year or whatever, then maybe we can rephrase the definitions of what's in each fund potentially. So.
but I do understand taking the word park out. That, you know,
Okay. Any other comments, questions, discussion? Pam, please.
And I just wanted to say that I will appreciate the twice a year report on investments.
Yep.
That's a good change.
I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, anyone else? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes with robust discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor, council members.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Next is item 5.2, and this is to set the sale for the city equipment certificates.
I would make a motion to adopt the resolution. Second.
We have a motion from Michelle, a second from Eileen. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
And then going back to the petitions, requests, and communications. Item 3.1 is a reappointment to the Merit Board of Lisa Lorish.
Move approval. Second.
Real quickly, I'd like to thank the ladies from Baker Tilly. Thank you so much for your work. We appreciate it. Okay, motion from Michelle, second from Pam. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 5.2, reappointments to the Planning Commission of
3.2.
3.2. Item 3.2 is reappointments to the Planning Commission of Ed Hahn and Dan Hall.
Move approval of those appointments. Second.
We have a motion from Michelle, a second from Eileen. Any discussion? George?
Two very good appointments.
I agree.
Very good.
Any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 3.3 is the Winona Main Street Program street closure request for October 29th.
Move approval of that request. Second.
Motion from Michelle, a second from Eileen. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 3.4 is the Katie's Place street closure request for October 8th.
Move approval of that request.
I'll second that.
Motion from Michelle, second from the birthday boy, Councilmember Rapinski. Any discussion?
Mayor,
Please.
I think they may only want that closed from the alley to 9th Street.
Okay.
Instead of from 8th all the way just from the alley going south.
Okay. We can make that change. Very good. Any other discussion, comments? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 3.5 is the temporary wine and malt liquor licenses for the Winona Arts Center.
Make a motion to approve those licenses.
Second that.
Motion from Michelle, second from Pam. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 3.6 is an updated ordinance for no parking bus zones on Main Street.
Make a motion to introduce the attached ordinance. Second.
Motion from Michelle, second from Eileen. Any discussion? I will say last week I did actually see someone at the stop that we are eliminating, and they were almost hit by a car trying to get across the street to Hiawatha there. So that, as soon as I saw the agenda item, I thought of that, and I think this is a good move. So it is, I'm sure, a little bit of extra time on that route, but I think it's a safe move. So any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 3.7 is a temporary license agreement.
Make a motion to execute the license agreement and accept the attachment of the license agreement between the Port Authority, City of Winona, and the Winona Real Estate Fund LLP. Second.
Michelle, second from Eileen. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
And item 3.8 is the request to accept a donation from the Werner Fund.
Make a motion to approve the attached resolution. Second.
From Michelle, second from Eileen. Any discussion?
Wow.
That's exactly what I was
Wow.
going to say, George. Wow.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I can top that, but thank you to his family and to James Werner himself for considering the library. What an amazing donation. What a legacy to leave.
Absolutely. I think we're working on that. Yes.
Does Leslie have any comments or?
Mayor and council, very briefly, I will just share a bit more about his life. He was born and raised here, and we are doing a little more ancestry digging at the library. But we think he had connections, either his uncle or his grandpa was part of the Werner contractor that got the bid on building the band shell. So there was a tie-in. He grew up on a farm near Waitoka and was a high school teacher in California his whole adult life. So Winona left a mark on him. I heard from his niece in California that she just said she and her brother were kind of left to the estate. And she said, we just really hope this makes a direct impact on your historical library in your lovely river town where we summered as kids.
Oh.
So pretty cute.
Yeah, thanks,
you.
Leslie. Any other comments or discussion? George?
Or Leslie, whoever, are there any things tied to it that it's got to be spent on this or spent on that, or has to buy books or?
No.
Okay,
And we haven't yet determined what would make the most impact. We have kind of a wish list of upgrading and adding security, technology, some furniture needs for patrons. That's where we're starting.
As Chad likes to call it, a needs list, not a wish
Yes,
list.
a needs list, not
Yes,
a wish list.
There we go.
very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Any other comments, questions, discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Moving on to item 5.3 under new business, the American Rescue Plan Act grant allocation.
I'd make a motion to approve the proposed allocation of the ARP grant funds.
Motion from Michelle, second from Eileen. Any comments, questions,
I
discussion?
have a question.
Eileen?
I just wanted to confirm that nothing has changed from what we tentatively approved in the budget. I'm assuming no, but just thought I'd ask.
Mayor and council, there is nothing that's changed from the budget, except we may have made what I would call minor changes to the dollar amount to really balance them out. I think I mentioned at the budget meeting as well. As an example, you see Madison Playground with an odd number. Otherwise, what was presented during the budget process is what you see before you tonight.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I'm glad we're finally doing something with this. We've been talking about this for as long as I've been in office. So I'm glad to see we're finally using these funds. Took some work, but we got there. George?
This mental health initiative, is that like for the art person or what's our plan going to be on that?
So Mayor and Council, as I mentioned during the budget process, we are still reviewing with Hiawatha Valley Mental Health, with Winona Health and Winona County, the best way to provide mental health assistance for our community members. So this is an item that will come back for council approval. In our early discussions with Winona Health and Hiawatha Valley Mental Health, we don't feel that the ARP program is the initiative that we would support. I think it would be best when we get closer to this time frame before it comes back for the official allocation of funds that we do a pre-council meeting and ask our community partners, Winona Health, Hiawatha Valley and Winona County, to do a joint presentation so that there is some better understanding on really what we call the crisis response team that really is in place in our community now, what impact that has and where there may be some greater needs. And so this is an item that would, although you're setting aside the dollars tonight, it would come back so that you understand how that $180,000 will be used.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon.
Could I ask a follow-up on that same thing? Do you anticipate this being an ongoing expense, or is this one time, or?
Mayor and Council, this is the mental health initiative is the one item within our ARP funding where this is likely an ongoing expense that we're going to be using one-time dollars, which is primarily from Baker Tilly, a recommendation that we don't do. So we certainly will take it, and that will be part of the evaluation process, is if the dollars that we set aside here can be put in future budgets, or if this is a multi-year allotment of the 180, not just a 180,000 one time. those are things that we're taking under consideration because again, the other items really are one-time costs and not ongoing costs.
Any comments? Yes, Pam.
Yes. Question, when will this come back?
Mayor and council, I don't have a real timeline for this. We meet with Winona Health on Wednesday, again to discuss. I will say that there is a hard deadline for us to allocate the funds and then spend the funds. So allocation, I'm looking to Jessica for some assistance on those dates.
The allocation is required by December 31st, 2024. And spending is required by December 31st, 2026.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Mayor and Council, I just would add that at least from a staff level, we certainly wouldn't want this to go on that far. Would hope that by early part of 2023 that we would have a pre-council to discuss this further. That we certainly aren't. Those are important dates. That's why I looked to Jessica for those dates, but we'll certainly bring something back in 23.
Good.
Any other comments, questions, or discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 5.4 are the Winona transit route changes, and this is to eliminate the stop on Sarnia Street. I would note that we did implement our major route change in September of 2021, and since that time, our ridership has increased. I think that's significant because we were anticipating with the way the routes are now structured that the ridership might actually go down because people are able to ride across town without transferring, and that counted as a separate ride. But we are pleased with the new routes, but the one issue we did have was the bus stop on Sarnia across the street from Hiawatha Valley. And just in discussing it with MnDOT, it just was a little too difficult to implement, and maybe Brian can talk to that also, but they don't want to have mid-block pedestrian crossings. If we did, it was unlikely MnDOT would reduce the speed limit. We would have to implement the handicap ramps and sidewalk on the park side, and you still have, the traffic would be at a high rate. So we felt it would be safer to eliminate that one. People traveling there can ride to the Walmart stop and back without being charged more. If they are on the north side of the street, we do still have a stop and a bus shelter there, so they can access the bus system from that side of the street.
And obviously, all my comments from earlier are for this agenda item, not the previous one. So sorry about that.
I'd make a motion to approve the route changes.
Second.
Motion from Michelle, second from George. Any other comments, Michelle?
Monica, I just wanted to thank you again for all of the work that you and others did to get these route changes. I'm not surprised ridership has gone up. It's a simpler system to use with less stops and a simpler transition. And I'm not surprised to hear more people are using it because it's quite a bit easier to understand and use. And all of those very identifiable, I don't want to call them boxes, but the little boxes I just think make it very simple to use. So
Eileen?
nice job.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle. Eileen?
I just have a clarification question. So the stop at Hiawatha Valley, now they can only, so the stop is only part of the schedule when it's coming westbound.
That's correct.
Okay, so people, great, because I was worried that we would have a shelter there and people would think they were gonna get picked up and they wouldn't.
Nope.
Great.
The southbound or the south side stop is still there, but the northbound one is being eliminated, correct? Other way around. Okay, sorry. Boy, I should just be quiet when I'm talking about these bus stops. All right, any other comments, questions, discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 5.6 is the certification of completion final estimate and resolution of acceptance for the 2022 bituminous mill and overlay.
Make a motion to approve the attached resolution.
Second.
Motion from Michelle, second from Eileen. We do have Brian here if anyone has any questions. Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 5.7 is the approval to solicit bids for the preliminary treatment building upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant.
Make a motion to approve the attached resolution.
Second.
Motion from Michelle, second from Eileen. Again, we have Brian here if anyone has any questions. Steve?
Brian, can you just remind me, this is the upgrades from just kind of the ongoing deterioration. It's not, this isn't the phosphorus stuff yet.
It's a precursor to the phosphorus.
Okay.
The only reason you're seeing this is it was in your budget.
Yep.
Budget's not approved, so we want to
Okay.
get it out for bids because obviously, the supply chain and everything else is really hampered.
Yep.
So I'm wanting to get ahead of this. That's why you're seeing it now. Otherwise, we probably would never see this because it would be in the budget anyhow. So
Gotcha.
this is the pre-treatment building. It's kind of a precursor to the phosphorus, but it doesn't directly deal with phosphorus. It's a building that we have a lot of electrical problems because the very caustic environment with the sewage gas and everything like that. We're gonna separate out the electric portion, redoing some of the grit chambers type of stuff to get stuff that shouldn't go through the digesters out of there beforehand. That's what this building is.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
believe
for
your
clarity.
quote was that sewage cuts through copper like butter.
Ew.
It makes it look really ugly.
Yeah.
It doesn't last long, although copper is pretty resilient.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for working on this, Brian. George?
Just one question, Brian. What's the status on the methane gas burner down there?
It has nothing to do with this building, just so you know.
No, not with this, but just,
It's actually profitable right now.
Okay.
It's not like a
Yes.
big boon moneymaker.
Okay.
It doesn't lose money right now. It's probably the best thing. The siloxanes in it make it a little more expensive to run than if it was just a regular methane. Like if you had a compost pile, that methane comes out of there clean. Being that I know with your hair, you use so much soap in it because you got so much hair.
Where did that come from?
Jumbo in that remark too, so throwing the stone right back at myself. If it wasn't for the soaps in our sewage, the methane burner would be a little more efficient, but it is what it is.
Okay,
So we have to take the soaps out first before we can use the methane.
okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Any other questions? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Item 7.1 is council concerns.
Start with Councilmember Wozzachowski.
You're gonna have it easy tonight. Happy birthday to Aaron. And when you are out traveling in the roundabout area, be very, very careful. A lot of construction going on. Traffic is moving. Just be cautious as you go out there. So, and the main roundabout it's spinning.
As long as George's bringing that up, tonight, actually, probably on your way home.
Yep.
There is a detour that goes from Frontenac to Louisa back to 8th Street because there's two culvert pieces. The big culvert goes between
Okay.
Lake and Shives. They have to relay two culvert pieces. So it's
They're
good,
huge.
good that you brought it up.
What time were they expecting to reopen that?
5 a.m.
Okay, great.
Oh,
because construction
They're
always
working
works this
all
way.
Right, yeah. So right at 5:01, we'll be, yeah,
You'll be through.
just planning for delays through that area. Yep.
Now you can drive me and pick me up tomorrow. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Councilmember Alexander.
Just a reminder, the cemetery walk at Woodland Cemetery this weekend. It is the 50s, so you may recognize a few characters from around town. If you head down there, George, you may recognize a few people. It's noon to 5 Saturday and Sunday. Happy birthday, Aaron.
Councilmember Iden. I'm sorry, that was all? Yep, thanks.
Nothing tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Mueller.
It's October now, which means it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There is a clothesline project that moves around the community to raise awareness about this issue, which is unfortunately prevalent in our community, just like many others. So that's all. Thank you.
Eileen. Councilmember Young.
No comments tonight.
Okay. Councilmember Rubinski.
Thank you, Mayor. Also, thank you for all the birthday wishes. Also, all the people out in the online land that had left me birthday messages. Thank you, all you folks also. Want to just remind people it is October and it is Smoke Detector Awareness Month. So put your batteries in your smoke detectors. Also want to say a big shout out and a thank you to the city employees and the city hall itself. I've heard a lot of great comments, the different individuals and the folks that I've dealt with, some of the people in the offices, Christy Steinfeld, Tina Stanton, excellent. And I think we're very proud of having employees like that. And I hear great comments from our city people about how all they like coming in and getting information from people. So not only to those ladies, but to everybody that works in the building himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
And finally, the consent agenda. There are 3 items. Approval of the minutes from September 19th, the final adoption of an ordinance to establish handicap parking on Mankato Avenue, and the ordinance to set the city fees, the fees for city services for 2023.
Move approval of the consent agenda. Second.
Motion from Michelle. I'll take a second. Pam, you said yes? Okay, I'll take a second from Pam. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes.
The time being 7:55 and there being no further business to come before the council this evening, I move we adjourn.
Motion from Michelle, second from George. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.